The fragile man concentrates. The disciplined man divides. Most people will spend their entire working life building on a single pillar, one income, one strategy, one concentrated bet, and never understand why the structure keeps failing them. King Solomon did not build enduring prosperity by maximizing one resource. He divided. In Ecclesiastes, the instruction is not to scale harder, it is to split your portion, because no man knows what misfortune the earth will bring. Wealth was never about how much you earn. It was always about how you divide what arrives. Tell me in the comments, were you ever taught this about money? The fragile man concentrates. The disciplined man divides. Read that again. Not because it sounds interesting, because it is the difference between a life that collapses under pressure and one that holds steady for decades. Most people will hear that sentence, nod, and move on. One concentrated bet on the future. And for a while, it will appear to be working. The numbers will grow, the confidence will build, the lifestyle will expand. And then, without warning, the structure they built on concentration will reveal its hidden flaw. That flaw is not bad luck. It is not poor timing. It is the architecture itself. What you are about to hear is not a budgeting technique. It is not a financial philosophy born in a seminar room or popularized by a modern personality. What you are about to hear is a structural allocation principle, ancient in its origin, deliberate in its design, and quiet in its operation. It has been preserved across centuries not because it promises speed, but because it delivers something more valuable than speed. It delivers endurance. Consider the average salaried professional. He earns a reasonable income. He works consistently. He is not reckless with money. He contributes to a retirement account, he pays his obligations, and he may even invest a portion of what remains. By most modern definitions, he is financially responsible. And yet, if his employer calls him tomorrow and removes that single income source, his entire financial structure begins to unravel within 90 days. This is not an edge case. This is the standard condition of most working adults in the modern economy. The income is real, the effort is genuine, but the structure beneath it is built on a single load-bearing pillar and a single pillar. No matter how strong, is not architecture. It is exposure. Society does not teach you to see this. In fact, society rewards the opposite. The language of modern wealth culture is the language of concentration. Put everything behind your strongest asset. Scale your best opportunity. Maximize your primary income stream. Double down when you are winning. These ideas are presented as discipline. They are dressed in the vocabulary of ambition and efficiency. But concentration is not discipline. Concentration is speed. And speed, without structure, produces a particular kind of destruction, one that arrives quietly, accumulates silently, and reveals itself only when pressure appears. The high earner, who loses a contract. The professional whose entire net worth sits in one asset class that corrects 40% in a difficult quarter. Each of these individuals worked diligently. Each of them followed the logic their environment gave them. And each of them is now experiencing the cost of a structural flaw that no one warned them about because no one around them understood it either. This is the modern wealth illusion. Not that income doesn't matter. It does. But that income alone, concentrated and undivided, produces the feeling of wealth while quietly building the conditions for collapse. The ancient world understood something different. King Solomon is remembered in the Western tradition primarily as a symbol of wisdom and prosperity. What is remembered less often is how that prosperity was structured. The wealth associated with Solomon was not the product of reckless accumulation or aggressive concentration into single ventures. It was the product of deliberate, disciplined allocation, the kind of thinking that views increase not as something to be maximized in a single direction, but as something to be divided with in totality. The book of Ecclesiastes, attributed to Solomon in the wisdom tradition, contains a verse that most people pass over without fully absorbing its weight. In the 11th chapter, the second verse reads, "Divide your portion to 7, or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth." Read that slowly. This is not a suggestion to diversify investments. It is a structural philosophy embedded in a line of ancient texts, one that warns directly against concentration and instructs, without ambiguity, that increase must be divided. Ancient Hebrew stewardship customs reflected this same principle in practical life. Trade was structured with divided portions. Land arrangements separated productive use from reserve. Merchants operating along trade routes did not consolidate all goods into a single caravan. They divided, not out of weakness, not out of fear, out of a structural understanding that the man who divides his assets across multiple vessels cannot be destroyed by the loss of any one vessel. This is not superstition. This is not ceremonial behavior disguised as financial advice. This is architecture. An architecture, unlike luck, is repeatable. The principle these customs encoded was simple in its statement and demanding in its execution. No single element of your financial structure should have the power to collapse the whole. Preservation must exist separately from growth. Growth must exist separately from covenant obligation. And covenant must exist separately from both, not as an afterthought, but as a structural equal. Here is the assumption most people carry without examining it. Put everything behind your best opportunity. It feels correct. If something is working, concentration accelerates the result. If your career is producing, invest more of yourself into it. If an asset is appreciating, concentrate capital into it. If a business line is profitable, scale it without distraction. The logic appears sound because it is productive in the short term. The numbers respond. The growth appears. And the mind, trained to measure success in linear terms, registers this as confirmation. But what has actually been built is a condition of total exposure. A merchant in the ancient trading world who placed every unit of valuable goods into a single caravan had, in effect, made a wager. Not an investment, a wager, because he had removed all redundancy from his structure. If that caravan arrived safely, he prospered. If it encountered misfortune, whether theft, delay, any of the countless variables that no man controls, he did not lose a portion, he lost everything. The merchant who divided his goods across 3 separate caravans experienced something different, not just in outcome, but in psychology. He was not more cautious, he was more structured, he slept differently, he negotiated differently. He made decisions from a position of stability rather than from the elevated anxiety of a man whose entire fate rests on a single moving variable. This is a psychological truth that concentration conceals. It does not just create financial fragility, it creates emotional fragility. The concentrated man must protect his position at all costs, because the cost of losing it is total. He cannot afford to think clearly in uncertainty. He cannot step back from a deteriorating situation and evaluate it calmly. He is too exposed to be calm. The divided man has something the concentrated man does not. He has margin. Not in the financial accounting sense, in the structural sense. He has space between the risk and the ruin. And that space is where clear thinking lives. Division creates endurance, not just in the balance sheet, in the mind. The principle that encodes this ancient structural wisdom into a modern applicable form is called the Sacred Thirds Covenant. It is not a budget. It is not a percentage-based saving strategy. It is an allocation identity, a structural discipline that dictates how every unit of increase is received, divided, and directed before it is touched by impulse or emotion. The Sacred Thirds Covenant divides every increase into 3 equal portions: preservation, multiplication, and covenant. Each third is equal. Not because the mathematics demand exactly 33% of every dollar, but because the equality of the division is itself the discipline. The moment you begin assigning unequal weight to 1/3 over another, you have introduced preference. And preference is the first concession to impulse. Impulse is what the covenant is designed to prevent. Preservation is the first third. It is stability capital. Not emergency money in the anxious, reactive sense of that term, but a structural layer of coverage that exists regardless of conditions. It is held in non-volatile form. It does not seek growth. It provides one function: continuity. The ability to remain unchanged when the environment changes around you. Multiplication is the second, third. It is measured, diversified growth governed by patience rather than ambition, allocated across vehicles that do not carry the same risk profile, and never funded by borrowing against the preservation. Third, its purpose is steady accumulation over long periods, not aggressive acceleration over short ones. Covenant is the third portion. It is the most misunderstood of the 3, and it is the most structurally significant. We will return to it. It is a structural commitment that prevents the entire system from being controlled by any single motive, including greed. This is the architecture. 3 equal thirds. 3 distinct functions, each one protected from the others, each one necessary for the structure to hold. There is a pattern visible in families who maintain financial stability across generations. Not necessarily wealthy families in the performative sense, not families defined by visible consumption or social display, but families who remain structurally intact across economic cycles. Families who do not collapse under recession, do not dissolve in the absence of a primary earner, do not require external rescue when conditions deteriorate. What these families share is not exceptional income. Income is not the differentiating variable. The differentiating variable is how they receive increased. They divide before they spend. This is the identity separation that most financial education never addresses. Before the question of what to spend arises, the question of how to divide has already been answered. The division is not reactive. It is not calculated on a spreadsheet each month with fresh deliberation. It is structural, automatic, pre-decided, removed from the emotional field entirely. Because emotion, applied to allocation, is the mechanism of imbalance. The salaried professional, in a moment of excitement, will redirect preservation capital toward an opportunity that feels compelling. The business owner experiencing rapid growth will drain his covenant allocation to fund expansion that appears inevitable. The investor whose multiplication third is performing well will concentrate more capital into that single vehicle and call it disciplined when it is actually exposure in a new form. The disciplined family does none of these things. Not because they lack ambition, is because they understand that the structure is the asset, not the income, not the investment return. The structure. This is why certain families rarely collapse. It is not luck. It is not inheritance, though some have it. It is an allocation identity that has been absorbed as behavior repeated so consistently that it no longer requires decision. It simply operates. Wealth has never been about earning more. Not at the structural level. Not in the ancient tradition that encoded this principle into stewardship, customs, and wisdom literature. Earning more without division produces a larger version of the same fragility you had before. The number is bigger. The exposure is proportional. Not what would you do, what would remain. If the answer is thin, if the margin between your current position and genuine difficulty is measured in weeks, rather than years, then the mechanism has not been applied. The income may be present. The growth may be real. But the structure is not there. And without structure, everything rests on continuation of a single condition. Ancient stewards did not build wealth on the continuation of a single condition. They built it on a divided structure that could absorb the failure of any one component and continue operating. The caravan model, the allocation model, the thirds model. The sacred thirds covenant is the formal expression of this thinking applied to modern increase. It is simple in its design. It is demanding in its execution. And it produces something that no single concentrated strategy can produce. It produces quiet stability, year after year, decade after decade. Not because the numbers are magic, because the discipline is consistent. There is a third portion within this structure that most people, when they first encounter it, assume is the least important. It is not. It is the one that holds everything else in balance, and without it, the other two-thirds eventually collapse into each other. That portion, and the reason it carries more structural weight than any single component has a right to, is what comes next. The covenant third is where most allocation systems fail. Not because people ignore it entirely, but because they treat it as optional. As the portion that funds itself after the other two have been satisfied, because the final consideration rather than the equal structural element it was always meant to be. This is a significant error. And it is not an error of mathematics. It is an error of architecture. To understand why the covenant third carries structural weight that extends beyond its proportional size, you need to understand what it is actually preventing. It is not simply allocating resources toward giving or legacy or long-term obligation. It is functioning as a structural counterweight to the most destabilizing force in any individual's financial life. That force is not market volatility. It is not economic recession. It is not even poor decision-making in the conventional sense. It is ego-driven expansion. Every financial collapse at the individual level, not the catastrophic visible kind, but the slow, quiet kind that unfolds over years, contains a common preceding condition. The individual in question reached a point of sufficient growth, and then, rather than maintaining the structure that produced that growth, expanded beyond it. They reinvested everything. They scaled without limit. Not through willpower, not through external accountability, through structure. When 1/3 of every increase is pre-committed to a purpose that exists outside your personal accumulation, to legacy, to obligation, to long-term alignment with something larger than your current position, it becomes structurally impossible to direct everything toward expansion. The system will not allow it, because the covenant is equal. It is not subordinate to ambition. It does not wait for ambition to be satisfied before it receives its portion. This is the hidden leva. Equal thirds protect against ego. Not through philosophy alone, through mathematics applied as discipline. Consider what full reinvestment actually means. The hustle culture narrative presents full reinvestment as the highest form of commitment. Every dollar earned goes back into the operation. Every surplus feeds the expansion. The message is one of total dedication. The individual who consumes nothing and builds everything is positioned as the ideal. But examine the structure beneath that narrative carefully. The man who reinvests everything has, in effect, merged his preservation and multiplication functions into a single, concentrated vehicle. He has no stable layer that is protected from operational risk. His security and his growth are the same asset, and when that asset comes under pressure, both collapse simultaneously. More significantly, he has eliminated the covenant function entirely. And without the covenant function operating as a structural counterweight, the growth trajectory is governed solely by ambition and momentum. There is no equilibrium point. There is no mechanism that prevents the expansion from becoming the structure scales until it cannot scale further, and then it does not gently plateau. It contracts sharply because every element of it was interconnected. This is not a fringe scenario. It is the standard outcome of undivided concentration applied over a decade. The Sacred Thirds Covenant does not produce this trajectory. It produces a different shape of growth, slower in its early stages, more disciplined in its middle stages, and dramatically more stable in its later stages. The compound effect of maintained thirds over 15 or 20 years does not resemble the steep curve of concentrated reinvestment. It resembles something quieter and more reliable, a gradual, uninterrupted accumulation that does not carry the fragility of a structure built on a single condition. Restraint multiplies. That is not a motivational statement. It is a structural observation. Let us bring this into a concrete illustration. A professional receives a monthly income. Before any discretionary consideration, before any expense is planned, before any opportunity is evaluated, the increase is divided. The first third moves immediately into non-volatile, stable storage. It does not seek a return, it provides coverage. The second third moves into a diversified, measured growth vehicle. It is not concentrated into a single position. It is allocated with patience rather than urgency. The third third is directed toward covenant commitments, long-term giving, family legacy infrastructure, or obligations that extend beyond personal accumulation. The professional does not deliberate over this each month. The division is mechanical. It happens first. Then, and only then, does the question of lifestyle and spending arise from the remaining balance after the structure has been honored. This sequence matters more than the percentages. Most financial approaches begin with income and subtract expenses, then consider what remains for savings or investment. This inverts the structure entirely. It subordinates allocation to consumption. It allows the lifestyle to define the margin rather than the margin defining the lifestyle. The Sacred Thirds Covenant reverses this. Allocation precedes consumption. Structure precedes scale. Division precedes spending. And the discipline of this sequence, maintained consistently over years, produces a compound effect that no amount of aggressive reinvestment can replicate, because it is protected from the volatility that aggressive reinvestment carries. This is not about the size of the income. A modest income, divided with consistency over 20 years, builds more durable wealth than a large income consumed with inconsistency over the same period. The mechanism works because it is structural, not because it is dependent on favorable conditions. There is a deeper transformation that occurs when this structure is maintained long enough. It is not primarily financial. It is psychological. The individual who has maintained the Sacred Thirds Covenant for several years experiences money differently. Not because he has read about financial psychology or adopted a particular mindset philosophy, because the structure has trained his responses. The anxiety that financial uncertainty produces in the undivided person, the level, persistent background awareness of fragility that most people carry without naming it, begins to diminish. Not because the income is larger, because the structure is sound. When you know that your preservation third is intact and untouched, you make decisions differently. You negotiate differently. You evaluate opportunities differently. The question is, no longer can I afford to miss this. The desperate calculus of the fragile position. The question becomes, does this align with the structure I have built? That is a different question. It comes from a different place. It produces different answers. Division reduces anxiety. Not as a side effect, as a direct structural outcome. The man who has divided his increase has removed the condition that produces financial fear, the condition of total exposure. He may not be wealthy in the visible sense, but he is stable in the structural sense. And stability, compounded over time, becomes wealth. The allocator and the concentrator do not simply manage money differently, they think differently. They occupy different psychological positions relative to uncertainty. The concentrator is always one variable away from disruption. The allocator has built redundancy into the system, and that redundancy has become a form of freedom. This is what the ancient framework understood that modern wealth culture does not teach. Wealth is not a number. It is a condition, and the condition is produced by identity, by who you are in relationship to increase, not simply by how much increase you receive. Allocation is identity, not a practice you adopt when the income is sufficient, an identity you inhabit from the point of first increase, regardless of scale. The anti-Hazel position is frequently misunderstood. It is not a passive position. It is not the rejection of effort or ambition. It is the rejection of expansion without structure. The hustle framework presents scale as the primary objective and structure as the obstacle to it. Move fast, reinvest everything, remove friction, maximize output. These instructions produce a particular kind of result, rapid, concentrated, fragile growth that carries within it the mechanism of its own disruption. The structured framework inverts the priority. Structure is the objective. Scale follows structure. When preservation is intact, multiplication can proceed without creating exposure. When multiplication is measured and diversified, the covenant third is protected. When covenant is consistently honored, the ego-driven expansion impulse has no fuel, because the system has already directed a structural portion towards something it cannot consume. This is not slower. It is more patient. These are not the same thing. Slower implies deficiency. Patient implies deliberate timing, the recognition that endurance compounds in ways that speed does not. The family that has maintained the sacred thirds covenant for a generation does not move quickly. They do not need to. Their structure moves steadily. And steadiness, applied over 30 years, produces outcomes that speed cannot reach, because speed, without structure, resets. Steadiness does not reset. It accumulates. Structure before scale. Always. The practice of this principle at the daily level is simpler than most people expect, and more demanding. Before any increase is spent, it is divided. This is a mental act as much as a financial one. The individual who has absorbed this structure does not wait for a monthly accounting moment to apply the thirds. He applies them at the point of receipt. Each inflow is assessed and assigned before it enters the general pool of available funds. The preservation portion is recognized and separated. The multiplication portion is directed to its vehicle. The covenant portion is acknowledged and committed. This takes time, not hours, minutes. But it requires the cessation of the impulse to spend first and account later. And that impulse is strong, not because people are undisciplined in a moral sense, but because the entire architecture of modern consumption is designed to capture increase before it can be divided. The daily ritual that preserves this structure is quiet. At the close of each day, or at the moment of each inflow, the individual mentally accounts for the division. Not with anxiety, with intentionality. The question is not, how much did I earn? The question is, how is the increase divided today? This ritual, practiced consistently, does not feel burdensome after a sufficient period. It becomes natural the way any deeply internalized behavior becomes natural. It is no longer a decision. It is a posture. A way of standing in relation to increase that has become automatic through repetition. And repetition, applied across years, becomes the inheritance a family passes forward. Not the wealth itself, though wealth follows. The posture, the identity, the structural discipline that makes wealth durable rather than temporary. Repetition shapes generations. The individual who divides today is teaching a pattern that compounds in ways that extend beyond his own financial lifetime. A calm warning. The greatest threat to this structure is not external disruption, it is internal impatience. At some point in the application of the sacred thirds covenant, the individual will encounter a moment that appears to demand exception, an opportunity that seems to require redirecting the preservation third into growth, a moment of rapid expansion that appears to justify suspending the covenant allocation temporarily, a period of pressure that makes the divisions feel like restrictions rather than protections. These moments are not accidents. They are the test of the structure, because the structure was not built for comfortable conditions. It was built for exactly these moments. The divisions exist precisely because disruption is inevitable and unpredictable. The merchant who maintained 3 separate caravans did not abandon the division when trade conditions became favorable. He maintained it because he understood that favorable conditions do not eliminate the existence of unfavorable ones. They simply delay them. And the delay is not a signal to dismantle the structure. It is a window to strengthen it. Imbalance, once introduced, does not correct itself automatically. It tends to compound. The first exception teaches the mind that exceptions are permissible. The second exception is smaller in the mind's accounting than it is in structural reality. By the third exception, the structure has become a suggestion rather than a discipline, and the protection it offered has been quietly dissolved. Do not make the first exception. Not because the opportunity isn't real, but because the structure is more valuable than any single opportunity within it. Stability precedes expansion. Not once, always. Return now to where this began. The fragile man concentrates. The disciplined man divides. King Solomon did not build prosperity through the maximization of a single resource. He built it through structured allocation, the disciplined division of increase into functions that protected each other, balanced each other, and prevented any single force from controlling the whole. The preservation third protects. It provides the continuity that allows everything else to operate without desperation. The multiplication third grows quietly, measurably, without the volatility that concentration produces. The covenant third anchors. It prevents ego-driven expansion from consuming the structure it was built within. 3 equal thirds. 3 distinct functions. 1. Integrated structure that holds across conditions that would dismantle concentration. This is not a modern innovation. It is not a financial trend. It is an ancient structural principle preserved in wisdom literature and stewardship custom, available to anyone who is willing to apply discipline before impulse, division before spending, structure before scale. The man who applies this consistently will not always appear wealthy. He will not announce his structure. He will not perform his discipline. He will simply continue dividing, allocating, and building, quietly, steadily, across years and decades, while the concentrated man cycles through growth and collapse, expansion and exposure, ambition and fragility. And when enough time has passed, the difference between the two will not require explanation. It will simply be visible. Gold that is divided with discipline becomes quiet strength. Not because division is magic. Because discipline, maintained across time, is the only form of financial power that does not eventually betray itself. Structured before scale, division creates endurance. Covenant thinking outlives income. This was known. It has always been known. The question is only whether you will apply it. The sacred thirds covenant, preservation, multiplication. Covenant 3, equal thirds. 1. Enduring structure. Begin dividing today.